Hello, once again from the Prim Reaper. So, you remember way back when how I was talking about doing a misuse of words transphobia video?
One eternity later.
Yeah. Whoops. Guess I got distracted with other topics. However, as is typical for me, something in particular has popped up and really brought this subject back into the spotlight for me, so I'm going to go ahead and tackle this topic right now. Just as a little refresher on the word phobia, because it's been so long since I did the last one. Once again, it refers not only to fear, but is also commonly used to refer to hatred of a given group as well. Now, let's be very clear here. Hatred, as you all well know, is a word that has its own definition, and I'm going to post it here as well, because it is very important that you know what the word hatred means for the context of this discussion. Hatred. The feeling of one who hates, intense dislike, or extreme aversion or hostility. As you can see, this fits in well with the definition of phobia. Extreme aversion, intense dislike. Please keep this in mind as it marks a significant point of contention in discussing this topic. Anyway, what inspired me to return to this discussion was a whole lot of caterwauling over a supposedly explosive tweet from J.K. Rowling. Shield your eyes, protect those around you with weak constitutions. We're going to reveal the tweet for all to see here. Dress however you please, call yourself whatever you like, sleep with any consenting adult who will have you. Live your best life in peace and security, but force women out of their jobs for stating that sex is real. Hashtag I stand with Maya. Hashtag this is not a drill. Okay, so I'll be honest, seeing this initially read explosive to me like a bell pepper reads spicy, so I figured that maybe I needed to get some further context. I've been out of the loop on so many things lately, I figured this Maya individual must be bad news. Looking further into it, Maya Forstater is essentially a woman who lost her job for posting tweets such as, "Men cannot change into women," and people are calling her a TERF or a trans-exclusionary radical feminist. Now, I have always thought that to be a TERF required not merely a belief that transgender people could not change sex, but that transgender individuals, in particular male to female transgenders, were attempting to maliciously infringe upon the female gender, minimize or make a mockery of female gender roles, or to try to invade female spaces, but apparently we've just gone ahead and pushed that envelope all the way. I'm not terribly surprised to hear that, to be quite frank. Now, this topic is a pretty enormous one to cover with a lot of different nuances to it, and I almost guarantee I'm going to have to divide it in 2 or even 3 videos if I want to have any reasonable sort of length here. So let's just begin with the basics. That is, what exactly does it mean to be a trans man or woman, and what does that mean, or what ought that to mean, for everyone else? Let me start off with a preface talking about my position. Quite simply, my view on the matter has always been very libertarian. I'm happy to call people whatever they ask me to call them, because I care more about someone's actions and the quality of their character than about the labels they choose to identify as. So if someone born as a man chooses to identify as a woman, or vice versa, I'm generally just happy that they're doing something that makes them feel better, and I'm happy to help facilitate that by honoring their request. Heck, if someone feels better identifying as a space monkey from Mars, more power to them. It's not my place to tell them how they ought to identify, even if I was so inclined to bother to do so. People doing things that make themselves feel better that doesn't negatively impact anyone else is generally my jam. Now, where things start to get a bit hazy is when other people begin to demand that everyone else unilaterally accept their identity without question, or to deny or misrepresent previously widely accepted biological realities to shield their feelings about the matter. But let's not jump ahead in the script. Let's start with some very general definitions. According to Merriam-Webster, to be transgender is to be a person whose gender identity differs from their identified sex at birth, and to be cisgender is to be a person whose gender identity corresponds to their identified sex at birth. Incidentally, according to the same website, the first known use of the words transgender and cisgender were 1974 and 1994, respectively. That is to say, though transgenderism as a definite concept has been around for a fair while now, It is quite a bit more recently that we as a society collectively decided that we ought to have a word to distinguish what we might have otherwise previously called a typical gender presentation. Now that I mention it, that's another distinction worth making, the difference between sex and gender. Gender, as it relates to the concept of one's social identity, you can call that a spectrum, non-binary, up, down, and all around as you like as far as I'm concerned. The concept has essentially been rendered maybe not quite meaningless by how loosely it is now used, but whatever. People even like to say that time-honored phrase, gender is just a social construct, which, in itself, is a phrase I would like to eventually do a video on. But even those who use this statement do so with the intention of minimizing its tangibility as a term. If they weren't, they wouldn't use it as an immediate retort to the sorts of people who like to say that there are only two genders. So there you go. Sex, on the other hand, is a biological reality of life. One of those sorts of things where if the human race were wiped out and a new intellectual species took over and started chronicling scientific knowledge over from scratch, it's the sort of concept that would certainly become obvious quite quickly, though it would likely be named something different due to the inevitability of the different language this new species would use. Sexual creatures, unlike asexual creatures, combine the genetic material of a male and female to reproduce and create offspring. I don't feel like I need to go into a full biology lesson on this point. There is some variation in the process amongst different species of creatures, but more or less the idea is generally the same. Now, I'm going to hit the big red pause button right here and address some arguments that I've been seeing lately to try to refute this fact, because people bring them up as though it's another trump card that immediately wins them the argument. I'm talking about both more general abnormalities in sexual development, i.e. intersex individuals, and more specific chromosomal abnormalities such as Klinefelter's syndrome or Turner's syndrome. I'm going to briefly explain each of these concepts here, not only to educate people, but also to demonstrate why I do not believe these afflictions represent challenges to the sexual binary. Intersex refers, generally, to an individual who does not completely fit the description of either male or female, but rather may have a range of characteristics belonging to both. This may present in a number of different ways, such as having some combination of internal or external genitalia belonging more traditionally to either males or females, e.g., having both ovarian and testicular tissue, differences in hormone production or in cellular ability to respond to hormones, e.g., androgen insensitivity, or chromosomal abnormalities such as having fewer or additional sex chromosomes, e.g., XXY, X, XXX, etc. Let's talk about some of these now. Klinefelter syndrome is a condition where males are born with an extra X chromosome, XXY presentation. Though some display no outward negative symptoms, others will have various effects such as cognitive and learning difficulties, decreased testosterone production, undescended testes, infertility, among other things. This syndrome has variants with even more X chromosomes, such as XXXY, which tend to exacerbate the aforementioned troubles. Turner syndrome is when one of the two X chromosomes in females is either damaged, altered, or missing altogether, monosomy X. Turner syndrome commonly results in short stature, possible loss of ovarian function, failure to undergo puberty, and infertility. XXX syndrome occurs when females have 3 X chromosomes rather than the usual 2. This particular syndrome seems to lead to milder effects, including taller than average height, possible delayed motor and language development, learning disabilities, and behavioral and cognitive difficulties. However, many women with XXX syndrome do not display symptoms and experience normal sexual development, including the ability to reproduce. These are some of the most commonly cited examples for why sex isn't just a binary or sex is a spectrum, but the main problem with that is that these conditions are not typical biological presentations in humans. That is to say, these are not alternate sexes, they are conditions representing something having gone wrong with typical development. This is also why many of these conditions result in infertility. I want to stress in here, because I know some folks might point it out, that I'm not meaning to say that fertility is required as a defining characteristic to belong to any one sex, or further, to be counted as human, as obviously this would exclude people who can't or even don't want to reproduce. I'm simply stating that many of these conditions cause infertility because chromosomal abnormalities are rarely particularly forgiving in that aspect. Mother Nature is pretty clever. She has ways of limiting the spread of ill-functioning blueprints. Saying these examples challenge the sexual binary is like saying that this fellow's existence means that we should state that humans are born with anywhere from 0 to 4 limbs. No, humans having 4 limbs is a typical development, as is the sexual binary. Now, let's be very clear here. This does not mean any of the following. A, that any of these people are any less human than anyone else. Unless you want to take that very literally in cases like the one I mentioned before. B, that any of these people are any less capable of living fulfilling lives as anyone else. Or C, that any of these people are less deserving of normal human respect and decency. I think that to present these examples the way that many people online do these days in the discussion about trans individuals is actually very patronizing. I know if I had any such condition, I would resent being told that I'm a perfectly normal sex variant when I know that I'm not, and promotes ignorance about what many of these conditions actually look like for those who have them. And really, it leads right into the main question about why we should need to take examples like these and present them as normal sexual variants in the first place. What has caused people to want to do this? I thought we were just talking about transgender people. You know, biological men who transitioned into women, and biological women who transitioned into men. What about these concepts speaks to a need for sex to not be binary? Well, let's try and dig a little further into it. As I mentioned earlier, gender as a concept is one that has become relatively easy to mold into whatever form one wants. For many people, the word gender has become equivalent with personality, which is a sad fact unto itself, but let's not get into that. Unfortunately for some, gender isn't enough. Now, if people want to claim that biological sex cannot be changed, all of a sudden, this has become transphobic. Let's look at an example that has come up concurrently with the whole J.K. Rowling debacle, which I will come back to, but probably not until the next video. A transgender woman named Debbie Hayton is now facing being thrown off a committee for proclaiming that trans women are in fact men. Now, let's look a little bit closer at exactly what it was that Ms. Hayton did. Here she is, presented in a photo smiling, wearing a t-shirt that says the phrase, "Trans women are men, get over it," juxtaposed next to a photo full of people wearing shirts that say the opposite. "Trans women are women, get over it." Hardly the face of a hardened criminal we're looking at here. Ms. Hayton isn't trying to express any sort of vicious dislike for herself or those like her. She's trying to be cheeky and push back on something she feels is an inaccurate representation of her identity as a trans woman. Even more pointedly, she said that being biologically male is the sole qualifying criterion for being a trans woman. Another trans woman in another article discussing this situation said the following: "The process of having surgery or hormone treatment cannot ultimately transform your sex. Every cell in my body has male chromosomes. I have a prostate. These things cannot be completely deconstructed. It is not possible to be biologically female, but that does not mean that I can't live a fulfilling life being treated as a woman." See, what I see here is a discussion between two types of individuals with two viewpoints that are both understandable in their own ways. Those arguing that trans women are women are trying to say that they are valid in their new identity as women, but those like Ms. Hayton and Ms. Harrison are saying that, in order to argue such a thing, a large part of their identity, that is, the fact that they are men who have transitioned into women, is being dismissed. If we just accepted both of these arguments as being two different sides of the coin and both equally acceptable viewpoints, I think we would have no problem. However, not only are we not saying that, but people are saying that Ms. Hayton's views are hateful. Evidently, this viewpoint goes beyond discourse and the expression of alternative viewpoints, and is now propagating hate speech against the trans community. This is just one example of the use of the word hate that we will come across in this discussion, and there will be many more where that came from. But it is interesting that a trans woman stating quite plainly that, in order for her to identify as a trans woman, rather than, say, a cis woman, she needs to have been born biologically male, is not seen as mere fact, or even simply as an affirmative expression of her own identity, but is seen as hateful. You know, I've heard plenty of discussions surrounding a biological component to the existence of transgenderism. typically talking about brain structures in transgender individuals being closer to their identified gender than their biological sex, although there are other researchers arguing that there are no differences between the male and female brain, so this is hardly a widely accepted fact. But it is only recently that I've begun seeing people argue that trans women or men are literally the sex they seek to identify as, and that to claim otherwise is all of a sudden hateful. In order to make these claims of hatred in what these trans women are saying, instead of a mere statement of fact, these other groups need to claim that their original biological sex either doesn't matter for their idea of womanhood or manhood, e.g., the sorts of people who claim that their remaining biological sex organs are now feminine or masculine to match their new identity, or that it simply didn't exist in the first place. What this says to me is not that these other trans people are confident in their identities. It says instead that they must deny reality lest they feel a great deal of shame. This is both sad and unsurprising. After all, it is a hallmark of gender dysphoria to feel that shame towards one's birth sex. However, rather than work to address that shame and accept the reality of transitioning into their desired identity as much as they are able to do, these people are demanding that their reality as belonging to their biological sex be denied, much like someone might deny that the Earth is round. Frankly, I don't see how it's not more distasteful to minimize the experiences of those with gender dysphoria who have made so many changes to their lives, many of which were likely highly uncomfortable and physically and potentially financially taxing, by saying, "No, it's fine, you're the sex you want to be regardless merely by identifying that way." I also feel like it's worse to proclaim the voices of these trans women as hateful just because they're discussing their experience in a way that makes others uncomfortable. Which in itself is a whole different inquiry. Why is a trans woman stating the necessary component of being trans, the definition I stated at the beginning of this video, that one needs to identify differently from their birth sex, uncomfortable for people? It's because the definition of what it means to be trans, and more pointedly for the sake of these videos, what it means to be transphobic, is an ever-expanding concept that is fast-growing wildly out of control. I've only begun to scratch the surface of things in this first video, and I feel like I've barely gotten anywhere. But quite honestly, if I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of endless, only tenuously attached concepts, I'm going to have to break this up. I'm going to try to get part 2 out as quickly as possible, not always easy, I know, to avoid having these being disjointed and no longer timely, as I plan to return to the J.K. Rowling tweet and some of the discussions surrounding that in the next one. So thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.